You can start. We're recording now.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Corey Scuia. I am a BCBA with the Jackson School District. A BCBA is a board-certified behavior analyst. I'm one of 2 behavior analysts that works in Jackson, and I'm part of a larger behavior support team that serves the whole district. Tonight, we're going to be talking about positive behavior supports to help your child with anxiety. So this is just what we'll cover in this presentation. I'll talk briefly about background data and statistics that relate to anxiety in children. Talk about anxiety, what it looks like, a behavioral approach to anxiety, including functional behavior assessment, or FBA. That's just a formal way that we look at behavior. We'll talk briefly about functions of behavior, why it's important to identify setting events and environmental variables, particularly related to anxiety. Some strategies to use at home. My hope is that everyone will hear this and have some strategies, be able to take some strategies away that they can use right away in their homes. And we will talk about some strategies specific to anxiety during the COVID-19 pandemic. Okay. So this data I compiled from the CDC, and it's their data from 2019. So just briefly, 7.1% of children between the ages of 3 and 17 years old are diagnosed with anxiety. And that number struck me because 7.1%, when you look at it, it doesn't seem like it's that big a number, but when you do the math, that actually comes out to be 4.4 million children. And that's a lot of children diagnosed with anxiety. And keeping in mind that these are children who are diagnosed. There are many children who are exhibiting anxiety symptoms related to anxiety who are not formally diagnosed with an anxiety disorder. So there are many, many more children affected. For children between the ages of 3 and 17 who have anxiety, more than 1 in 3 of them also have some behavioral difficulties or challenges, and that comes out to about 37.9%. So again, this is speaking about children who are diagnosed with anxiety. So if you think about that, there's many, many more children that might have some behavioral difficulties associated with or secondary to anxiety. A diagnosis of anxiety is much more common with increased age. I think oftentimes, especially with younger children, sometimes professionals and parents alike, all of us collectively, sometimes we will think that it's a phase and that it might get better over time. So I think, that diagnosis is much more common as children get older. Behavior problems are more commonly identified among children between the ages of 6 and 11. And again, if you think about it, certain disruptive or tantrum behaviors that you see in a very young child, you might attribute to their young age and say, okay, well, it's normal for a 5-year-old to have tantrums or something like that. So typically those types of things are identified later on. With a diagnosis of anxiety in children, again, between the ages of 3 and 17, it's increased over time. The CDC says an increase of 3% between 2003 and 2011 and 12. And when you think about the fact that we're talking about 4.4 million children who are diagnosed, a 3% increase is significant. If that were to continue, we would see many, many, millions of more children diagnosed. And I think given our current circumstances, these statistics were put together in 2019, which is prior to the COVID pandemic. I think these numbers, unfortunately, are going to increase given our current circumstances. Okay, so what does anxiety look like? I put this slide in, actually, I prepped this presentation, part of it anyway, prior to the pandemic. And so my goal here was to, in an in-person format, have everyone kind of talk about what anxiety looks like in their children or in themselves when they're stressed out. What behaviors do they exhibit? How does their behavior change? But given that we're doing this virtually, if you just want to take a minute and think about either how your own behavior changes when you're stressed out, or how your child's behavior changes when they're feeling stress or anxiety, just something to think about as we move on. So talking specifically about what anxiety actually looks like, we want to keep in mind that the behavioral symptoms secondary to anxiety are different for all children. And for those, it's different for everyone. There are many common characteristics related to anxiety that have been identified by professionals over the years, but again, it'll look very different for any child affected by anxiety or an anxiety disorder. So we look for things like decreased attentiveness. Certainly you can see this in your children at home. This is definitely something we would see in a school setting because, as you can imagine, there are many more opportunities in a school setting where a child would be required to attend. So we are asked to consult all the time to assist students who are having some difficulty attending. So this is definitely something we see on a regular basis. Irritability, mood swings, repetitive behaviors and repetitive thoughts. There's certainly a very high comorbidity between anxiety disorders and OCD or obsessive compulsive disorder. That does not mean in any way that if someone has an anxiety disorder, they also have an OCD. What it means is that we oftentimes will see repetitive behaviors or repetitive thoughts happening as a symptom of that anxiety. A lot of children will engage in things repetitively, almost as a coping mechanism or a calming mechanism. It's something that helps them. Think about the things that you might do repetitively to try to decrease your anxiety. So the example I hear people talk about all the time as adults is, they might check 3 times to see that the stove is turned off before they leave the house. So that's something repetitive that you're doing. And it's a repetitive behavior and it's decreasing your anxiety. If a repetitive behavior or repetitive thought is not impacting your daily routine, your quality of life, your ability to be available for learning, for example, if those things aren't happening, then it's fine. But, we look more closely at these things when they're impacting day-to-day routines and quality of life. Reluctance or refusal to go to school. There are tools specific to school anxiety that we will use because this is something common. Restlessness, fidgeting, fatigue. If you think about any time that you've been particularly stressed out, anxiety can be exhausting. There's a lot of physical symptoms that go along with being anxious. And if you're anxious for, any length of time, it's likely that you're going to be tired. So just to continue with that for a second, disruptive behaviors, and that's sort of a catch-all term, but this is certainly something we would notice in the school setting, and you might see it at home or when you're out in the community with your child as well. And I touched briefly on fatigue, but just to talk about those physical symptoms for a second related to anxiety, increased heart rate, sweating, shortness of breath, fatigue I mentioned, and muscle tension. And there's others as well. These are just a few, but children will sometimes complain of headaches, belly pain. There's different physical symptoms that are manifested secondary to anxiety. Okay, so talking about a behavioral approach to anxiety, this is just to talk about when we're looking at the behaviors associated with anxiety, how do we go about that? How do we assess that? Why do we assess it? What are we looking for? And just keep in mind that I'm talking about this tonight as it relates to anxiety, but this in general is how we assess behavior. So if a child is diagnosed with an anxiety disorder, for example, and they're exhibiting certain behaviors, we would certainly want to take a look at any behaviors, like I said before, that would be impeding on their daily life, their day-to-day routine, anything that's a hindrance to their quality of life or their availability for learning or certainly their safety. We would take a look at any behavior related to that. It doesn't matter if the child is diagnosed with anxiety or anything else or has no diagnosis of anything. We look at the behaviors in and of themselves. We're talking specifically tonight about anxiety, but this is how we go about it, just generally speaking. So one of the ways that we will assess behavior is by using something called a functional behavior assessment, or an FBA. And the reason we do this is to identify setting events related to anxious behaviors, or, like I said, any other behaviors that we want to take a look at. We want to look at environmental situations that are related to the behaviors associated with anxiety. We want to define behaviors related to anxiety. So when we go in and complete a functional behavior assessment, the reason we want to define behaviors more specifically is to make sure that everyone is looking at the same thing and everyone's on the same page. So if a parent or a teacher tells me that a child is anxious and they have all this anxiety, I don't know what that means as a person who has never seen that student or that child before. So I might ask some questions, and I'll say, okay, that student is anxious, or your child is anxious. What does that look like? And that's when I start to get some answers like, well, they get out of their seat a lot. They're fidgety. They're crying. Every time we go to the store, this happens. So once we get more specific, we can start to define those behaviors. When we complete the assessment, we put together what are called operational definitions. And we just talk very specifically about what the behavior looks like. And in this case, it would be, what do behaviors associated with anxiety look like? The way we do this is by observing the student in a variety of settings. We collect data during those observations, and then we analyze that data to give us more information. And the reason we analyze all of that data is because we want to understand the function of the behavior. So the function of the behavior is, it tells us why the behavior is maintained, why does it keep going, and we're really looking at all the environmental variables surrounding that behavior. And the reason is because we're looking to change the events around that behavior in order to change that behavior. We're not changing the child, we're changing the events surrounding the behavior. So when you think about function, or the why, you want to think sort of an easy way to look at it is to think everything we do serves a purpose. A lot of people will say behavior is communication, and that is true. There's a reason we do everything we do, and not just children, all of us. If engaging in a behavior results in a change the child wants, there's an increased likelihood that he or she will engage in that behavior again. The function of a behavior is to make a desired change in the environment around us, and this is true of all of us. Okay, so I'll just talk very briefly about this, but when we talk about functions of behavior, or why behavior continues to happen over time, we want to look at these 4 areas. So when we obtain data through observing a behavior and we look at it, we're looking to see if it fits into any of these categories, for lack of a better word, and we're looking for a pattern. So one of the reasons that behavior is maintained over time is because we are getting attention for it. So we're getting social attention either from, if it's a child, they're getting attention from adults, or if they're in school and engaging in a certain behavior, they're getting attention from peers. So think about, a student maybe at lunch who does or says something funny, and all the kids laugh, and they like that type of reaction from their peers. They're likely to engage in that behavior again because they liked it when all their friends laughed when they did something silly. The next function to talk about is access to a tangible item or activity. So one simple example of this would be, if a child is out at, let's say, the library or any other place where maybe you need to be quiet, and they start, they're loud, they're crying, they're making noise, and their mother gives them candy or gum or a lollipop or something like that in the hopes that they'll be quieter in that setting. They're likely, if they like whatever they were given, candy, a lollipop, whatever it is, it's likely that they'll engage in that behavior again to gain access to that item. If you think about that from an adult perspective, for those of us that are working and getting a paycheck, our behavior of going to work is reinforced by that paycheck that we get, that access to money, that tangible item. We are much more likely to go to work week to week if we get paid for doing so. The next function is escape or avoidance. So this is when we engage in a behavior to avoid or escape something aversive, something we don't like. So when we talk about anxiety in particular, if we're talking about a student in a school setting, for example, who has difficulty with writing, and they get anxious at that point in the day, or if you have a child who is afraid of the dark or doesn't want to go to bed at night, and their anxiety increases at that time, you might see behaviors at that time or during that activity that help them to avoid that whatever's happening around them that they're afraid of. So in other words, or it's something they find difficult. So to use the student in the school setting, like if they find handwriting to be difficult and therefore anxiety producing, when they're given a task and asked to write something, if they crumple up the paper and throw it on the floor, or they swipe their work materials off their desk, they engaged in that behavior and then avoided that demand. So escaping or avoiding a demand or something that we find aversive or that we don't like, if it results in that demand going away or that aversive situation going away, we're likely to do it again. And then the last function to talk about just really briefly is behaviors that are automatically reinforced. So these are things that are more intrinsic in nature. So in other words, if I have an itch on my arm and I scratch it, and then that uncomfortable feeling goes away, I'm more likely in the future to scratch my arm when I feel that, because I am escaping that uncomfortable sensory stimulation. So students who want to access certain sensory stimuli, or they want to avoid certain sensory stimuli, they will engage in certain behaviors to do that. This would be completely different than the three functions we talked about before, because this one does not involve another person most often. If you are engaging in a behavior to gain attention or access to a tangible item, or to escape or avoid a demand, which were the first three functions that we talked about, those usually involve another person. Attention from a person, someone's giving you that tangible item, or someone asked you to do something and then you're avoiding that. These typically involve someone else. This automatic reinforcement piece, you're doing something and you're probably going to do it regardless of whether or not there's other people around. So these in general are the 4 reasons why we engage in any behavior that we engage in. Okay, so just to talk for a minute about some strategies that you can use at home, and these are for the most part specific to anxiety, but you can use them for any challenging behaviors that you might be dealing with in the home setting. So the first one, and it's interesting because someone looked at this presentation and said, I think you have a typo in this first one, but try not to avoid triggers. The person thought that it should say try to avoid triggers. And I said, actually, no, that's not it. You want to try not to avoid triggers or things that might make your child anxious. And this is because if you continually avoid those triggers, they don't learn to work through it, for lack of a better way of phrasing that. But you want to expose them to things in a way that makes it so that you're there and available to help them instead of avoiding those triggering events altogether. Breaking difficult activities or routines into steps can be helpful. That example I used a minute ago about behaviors that occur as a result of demands being placed or an activity being presented that makes someone anxious. This would be helpful in that situation. If you break something into steps, any activity or routine, the demand will be lessened in the child's mind. It will seem a bit easier and a bit more manageable if it's broken into steps. You want to set clear expectations. many children will become more anxious or engage in behaviors related to their anxiety if they don't know what's coming next, or if they're not clear as to what the rules are or what the schedule is. When you hear people say that, oh, they're testing limits, that child's testing limits, this is what they mean. Those boundaries that are there that provide that structure and that consistency and that routine, those are calming for many children. So setting clear expectations so that your child knows what's happening and what's expected is always a good idea. You want to try the best you can to prepare your child for changes or transitions that will be coming. You can use visual aids or schedules for this. If your child's able to read, you can write out a schedule each day or for certain activities or any changes in routine. If your child's unable to read, you can use visual aids or pictures to do this. You can use first then statements. You can incorporate that with the schedule that I just talked about, or you can use short first then statements and just verbally say to your child, first we're doing this, then we're doing this. First this, then this. Again, it goes back to that expectation. They know what's happening now, they know what's coming next, and that can be calming for a lot of kids. You can use timers to provide a definitive end for certain activities or routines. So if you think about particularly younger children, time is very much an abstract concept, and a timer can provide a tangible end to something that feels like it's never going to end. So oftentimes I've recommended to parents, I'll use toothbrushing as an example. A lot of kids just either they don't want to brush their teeth or they just don't want to do it for the 2 minutes or whatever it is they're supposed to be, that length of time they're supposed to be doing it for. So I'll recommend to parents that they set a timer for that. And instead of saying, okay, you can be done brushing your teeth in 2 minutes, you can say when the timer rings, you can be done brushing your teeth. If they don't have a concept of time, just yet, 2 minutes won't have any meaning, but the timer will. You can build a coping kit for your child and have it in the home. You can have a list of things that they can pick from. You can have a menu of pictures that they can pick from. We will do this in school with students as well. And these are just some examples of what could be in their coping kit. Obviously, it would be different for every child, but deep breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, using a stress ball, writing, drawing, or getting help from an adult, which I know seems strange to have kind of in their toolkit. But a lot of students, when they're upset, or a lot of children, when they're upset, they'll forget that they can ask for help and that someone, if that works for them, someone can help to calm them down. So just a reminder that that's available to them is sometimes a good idea. You could consider creating a calming area in your home. Again, we do this in classrooms for students, just a place where your child knows they can go if they need a break, if they need to calm down and just relax and kind of regroup, reset. It's nice to know that they have that place to go to if that's something that they need. You can make a support system list for your child. I think this is particularly important for older children, particularly adolescents, who I think right now with all the changes that we've been going through, the changes with regard to their social routines and maybe not seeing friends as much and things like that, this I think is a great idea, so that there's literally a list of people that your child can reach out to. And these are just some more strategies that you can use in a home setting. I mentioned this before, but you want to try and stick with routines as often as possible. Make and post a schedule for the whole family. I talked about a timer, but I added that here as well. Allow children to participate in the schedule. For example, you can have them cross off activities as they're completed or as they move through the schedule. If your child's not able to read, you can use pictures and develop a visual schedule. I mentioned that before. If your child is doing a lot of schoolwork at home, which a lot of students are now, try and schedule frequent breaks from schoolwork. If this is something that is causing anxiety for your child, it isn't for all kids, but if you notice that since the amount of schoolwork they're doing in the home setting has increased and that is causing some anxiety, you might even want to schedule those breaks in there so that they have those available. Try and remember to validate your child's feelings when they communicate their stress or their anxiety. They're feeling a lot of the same stressors we are with regard to the current circumstances, missing friends, missing special events, and all of that. So if they do come to you and initiate that and communicate that, you want to validate their feelings. So I put this slide in. I have a very good friend who is a pediatric nurse practitioner, and she works in a pediatrician's office. And as you can imagine, given everything going on with the pandemic, she's seeing all kinds of things in that practice, but a significant increase in the number of patients she's seeing who are dealing with anxiety. And parents are coming to her and asking her, what do I do? What do I do? So she called me for some behavioral strategies and recommendations. And when I told her I was putting a presentation together related to anxiety, she asked me if I would throw this in here. And I thought it was a really good idea, because to be quite honest, as a behaviorist, when I look at behavior really closely and I focus on all these things and I try to come up with all these strategies, these are the ones that I forget. So focusing on the basics is important. Getting enough sleep, eating healthy foods, hydration. This can be particularly important with regard to anxiety. One of the physical symptoms of consistent, frequent anxiety can actually be dehydration. I didn't mention that earlier on the list of physical symptoms, but hydration is key with regard to anyone who's dealing with prolonged periods of anxiety. Providing downtime for your kids. I think schedules have changed a bit, currently, but prior to the pandemic, our kids are very scheduled. They're busy. They don't just have school. They have, sports and different organizations that they belong to, things they do, extracurriculars. So providing downtime, especially if you're noticing signs of anxiety in your child, is always a good idea. And then outdoor play and exercise are really important. Okay, so there's just a couple of slides here that we'll talk about, and this is how you navigate. We're going to talk about how you navigate anxiety related specifically to the COVID-19 pandemic. So what do we know so far? I took a look at, we are 6 to 7 months into the pandemic at this point, unfortunately, and we do, though, have the benefit, though, of 6 months worth of information. So there are mental health professionals that have been looking at things more closely, and how has this changed our behavior? What new concerns are they seeing in our kids? So based on everything I was able to look at while I was preparing this presentation, this is what I was able to come up with. Certainly the COVID-19 pandemic has had a significant impact on human behavior. That's obvious. Changes to daily living have occurred abruptly and in an unprecedented way. And social implications include changes in behavior related to anxiety, particularly separation anxiety in children. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. So if you think about it, as a result of the pandemic, many of us have spent significantly more time at home with our families, and that would obviously include children. And as children return to school or childcare settings, there's the potential for behavioral changes related to separation or social anxiety. And given the circumstances, this was just something I added. Given the circumstances, this may occur in children who didn't previously have difficulty separating from family members. So, if prior to the pandemic, your child wasn't dealing with separation anxiety, they didn't really have social anxiety, they weren't afraid to go to school, given the huge changes that were sort of thrust upon us in a very short period of time, and the huge adjustments that we all had to make, you might have children who are experiencing these things and they didn't previously. So these are just some suggestions for talking with children specifically about COVID-19. I just put this one slide together related to this. So in terms of what I could find in the literature, this is what's out there. Encourage your child to ask questions about the pandemic. Be receptive to their questions. And don't avoid questions that you can't answer. So in other words, it's okay to say, I don't know. I mean, there's going to be a lot of instances where you don't know the answer to the question. There's so many things none of us know about this disease. If you're able to say, I don't know, when your child asks you a question, it does teach them to tolerate uncertainty. And as unpleasant as that feels, for all of us, it's something necessary that we have to go through, and teaching it to our children, just being able to deal with that uncertainty is a good thing. Provide developmentally appropriate answers. So obviously, if you're talking to a younger child, you don't want to talk in detail about grim, statistics and things like that. One, because they wouldn't understand, and two, because it's obviously scary. Be reassuring when talking to them about this. And talk about all the things you're doing or that you can do to be safe. So the mask wearing, hand washing, social distancing, calling the doctor if someone at home is not feeling well. Just reminding your child, yes, this is scary, this is hard, what we're going through, but these are all the things that we're doing to try to make it that we all stay safe. I talked a minute ago about separation anxiety as it relates to the pandemic, and how there's the potential to see more of this, and they're already seeing more of this as children who have spent a lot of time at home are now going back into the school or childcare setting. So these are just some strategies specific to separation anxiety. You want to listen and look for both verbal and nonverbal cues regarding your child's level of stress. And this would be true of any type of anxiety. But, if they're for older children, they may be vocalizing their feelings. If you're talking to a younger child about something that's making them anxious, you could consider asking them to draw a picture about what they're feeling. With younger children, an understanding of emotions and feelings and being able to name and label those feelings. That's kind of an abstract concept if you think about it. And so younger children might have some difficulty with that. So drawing a picture can be helpful in that situation. If possible, and the school year has already started, but if there's another setting where your child will be returning to that setting and they seem anxious about that, you might want to talk to the adult that's in that setting. If it's a teacher, a coach, like if their sports are starting back up or something like that, and talk with that person about what the routines and the day-to-day or the different get-togethers will be like, so that you can talk to your child about those routines while you're home, so that you can sort of prep them and talk to them about it ahead of time. You want to try and model calm behavior during challenging situations. This is obviously way easier said than done, but it is important. Your child will look to your reaction in certain situations, and if it's possible to try to keep yourself composed if something particularly difficult is going on, that will be beneficial down the road. In terms of separating from your child, if you're dropping them off somewhere, you want to let them know that you're leaving. Try to avoid that sneaking out thing. That some parents will sometimes do that when dropping off, particularly a young child, like at a childcare setting or something like that. You want to keep your explanation clear and concise, particularly for younger children. When parents ask me about this specifically, I'll always say to them, keep it business. Say goodbye to your children, make sure they know that they love you, but you just you say it and you're done. Keeping it business is the best way to go in that particular situation. If you're dropping your child off at school or childcare, leave without wavering. Try to avoid prolonging that departure or going back and forth. And these are just a handful of strategies specifically for parents with what we're going through right now related to the pandemic. We've talked a lot about strategies for your children. But these are just a couple of things that, may or may not be helpful for you right now. If the current events make you anxious, you might want to limit the amount of time that you read or watch the news. I used this strategy in the early stages of this pandemic, March, April. I really had to limit the time I was watching the news. And in the age of smartphones and tablets and everything else we have, we're all getting news alerts on our phones or whatever on a very regular basis. And for me personally, what I had to do was turn the news alerts off my phone. And that made a world of difference. That's just me. But, if the news is making you anxious, just limit your time and limit your time on social media. Same is true here. People post things on social media about current events. And if that is a cause of stress for you, you can limit your time on social media. Try when you can, as difficult as it is, to practice self-care, anything that works for you, exercise, meditation, anything that you find calming or relaxing, just even if you can squeeze in just a little bit. Stay connected to your support network, the people around you that you're close to that are supportive to you. Do it virtually if you have to keep everybody safe. But always a good way to sort of kind of bring yourself back is to remind yourself you have these people that support you. Set achievable goals for yourself and for your children, for your families. And this might mean that your goals look a little different than they used to. In the spring, when we first moved into remote learning, and teachers were repeatedly asking me, how do I work on this goal or this goal or this goal during remote learning? And, we would talk about ways to do that. But then also what I often, heard myself saying to the teachers I consulted with and to the parents I was talking to as well was, for the time being, just temporarily, we might have to change our goals a little bit. So for right now, it might be that they're sitting and attending to learning in this format, and then we move on to the other goals. So, if you have to change the goals that you have set up for your family with everything we have going on, then that's okay. And these are just some resources. I put links to a couple of resources in the presentation, which will be on the website. So people will be able to access it. The first is the National Association of School Psychologists has a really wonderful COVID-19 resource center. The Child Mind Institute has some really great back to school resources. And Autism New Jersey, on their website, they have a very large resource and article library specific to COVID-19. So there are things there for families, for children, for educators, a lot of information on their website. And that's it. I just want to say thank you. My email is there. Please reach out to me with any questions regarding this presentation or anything that was talked about tonight. And those are just my references. And that's it. Thank you very much.
I am going to end recording if anyone should have any questions. Stop.